So now stepping into our garden plan, each spring we plant greens that can grow fairly quickly, that can be tolerant to the colder temperatures. We're going to go into more deep detail about this garden plan. Um, and we also provide garden plans for the summer and fall seasons. So today we're focusing on spring. And the first thing that we want to do when preparing for our spring is prepare the soil. So what that looks like is if you've had any weeds or any plant material that stayed in your garden through the winter, you'll want to pull those weeds and turn them into the soil. That plant debris just adds more organic matter into the soil, and it breaks down and it holds nutrients and it holds water. So every workshop, this is also a good time to add fertilizer and nutrients to your soil. Every workshop, usually in person, we distribute fertilizer, Sustain fertilizer, which is a slow release fertilizer, meaning it gives nutrients to the soil throughout the growing season. Because we are uncertain on the timeline of being back in schools, we're still developing a strategy to distribute those fertilizer bags. Again, once we have more information, we'll be in touch about that resource. So what I like to do with my fertilizer, if you have fertilizer at home and are thinking about putting it in your garden, I like to add it before I even turn in the weeds, so that when I mix those weeds in, I'm also mixing in the nutrients of the fertilizer. Then lastly, just take time to flatten your seed bed, so making sure the soil is nice and smooth and ready for planting. So I'm going to hand it off to Catherine now, who's going to walk us through the spring garden plan.
All right, so for those of you who are familiar, Big Green every season provides a sample garden plan for what can be planted in Chicago at this time of year. So of course we've used the Learning Garden layout, but we're not in school right now. So I do want to bring your attention to the fact that these crops can be planted if you have a little bit of soil at home or a pot. We'll be talking a little bit later about doing some seed starting in a home environment. But just so that you're familiar with what can grow in our environment in the springtime, we've got this sample layout. So things like lettuce, pea shoots, arugula, spinach, radishes, and turnips are all really great spring crops. They love the cool weather, they grow really quickly, and a really great thing about them is that you can seed them directly. So you don't need to worry about seedlings or that kind of thing. You can just start the seeds directly into some soil. A lot of these crops are actually called cut and come again. So you can harvest them multiple times, which is a really great thing about greens. I will note that for the spring, when we say pea shoots, those would be peas that you plant and then harvest in their immature stage. So as like a tiny shoot, the first growth. But then if you leave those to keep growing through the summer, they will produce full pea pods. And then I also want to note that in your learning garden, you may have planted some garlic in the fall. If you had planted it, it would have been around November. That will start coming up around this time of year. You just want to leave it. That's actually not harvested until July when it's mature. And then perennial herbs, when we say that phrase, that means the herbs that are going to come back every year. The ones that we provided last year, if you were with us, were sage, chives, thyme, oregano, rosemary, and lavender. So those may still be in your learning garden coming back. So we just reserve some space in our plan for that. And then the last thing I want to bring your attention to on our spring garden plan is under the climate and season box. The last average frost date is May 15th, but all of these plants that are listed here, you don't need to wait to the last frost. They're actually cold tolerant enough to be able to be planted now, even if there's a little snow, even if it's still a little frosty, they're totally able to handle that. So if you've planted in the fall or spring with us before, you're familiar that we use 2 different planting methods. So broadcast seeding, which is the sprinkle, tickle, pat, which you can do with spinach, arugula, and peas. Just note that peas need that extra little poke to go a little bit deeper down. The other form of planting for these seeds would be to use like a seed spacer or some sort of measuring out or a finger to do 2 inches between each seed. And the only thing you're going to want to do that with is radishes and turnips, because they're going to need enough space to grow width-wise. We also did recommend since we have a few different kinds of lettuce varieties, to actually broadcast them into rows. So doing bands of lettuce, it makes it a little bit easier to harvest the different kinds and save a little bit of your seeds. And then, yeah, as far as planting dates go, we are good to go planting for the spring. And you can plant these things anytime until mid-May. So if you have a little soil at home, I encourage you to try out a couple seeds. Of course, like, we're not at school right now, so we won't be planting at schools right now, but it is the spring season officially. And then watering, as we know, is fundamental to the success of any garden or plants. Particularly the first 10 days to 2 weeks, the seeds really need to stay moist so that they can properly germinate. And then even when they're young seedlings, they're really tender and they dry out quickly. So it's important that they stay consistently wet. So we have on our website a few different watering options. You may have seen us do upcycled watering cans. So that's using a milk jug or a water bottle or a milk carton to have students actually make their own watering cans. That can be a really good at-home craft as well. And that's really good for younger students who may not be able to carry the weight of a traditional watering can. If we've done an event at your school, we've likely done the little rain clouds activity, which is having students use a cup of water. You can always top water with a hose. And then we also have the irrigation system in many of our gardens. Although, just a note about that, when you're watering new seeds, that irrigation might actually lay below the depth that you're planting the seeds. So it may not be actually watering those seeds. So it's always good to top water, at first when you plant seeds, just to make sure they're getting that water. And then as far as checking to see if you need to water, you can always do the finger test, which is just to put your finger into the soil. And if it comes out wet, then your soil is wet enough. If it's dry, it probably needs a little bit of water. And yeah, of course, if it rains or something like that, then you probably don't need to water. And then, yeah, just another note about watering: once you do start to see leaves and seedlings develop, we always want to be sure that we're watering the roots of that plant and not the leaves or the stem, because the roots are where they're going to take up their water. And then a final note: I know everything's up in the air right now, but we do want to make a plug for the practice of tracking harvests. So it can be good to measure your harvest from year to year, season to season, see how things are changing. Again, things like lettuce and spinach and pea shoots and arugula, even you can harvest and harvest again multiple times. Tracking your harvest is just a really good practice as a gardener to understand how much your garden produces. As far as in the context of the school community, we do have an online link to track harvest from Learning Gardens, and we share out, if you submit data to us, then we'll share out a report about how much that produce was valued at, how much you grew, how many serving sizes, and we can make that into a report that you can share with your school community, which can be a great way to just celebrate together, your accomplishments as a team.